Welcome back to Special Ed on Special Ed. Thank you so much for joining me. I am your host, Dana Johnson. This episode is going to air on December 14th, 2022, which is the 10-year anniversary of the Sandy Hook shooting. And I am so honored to have Deb Del Vecchio-Scully here with me to discuss some of the long-term impacts of these school shootings on students, not just those from Sandy Hook or the local area, but everywhere. These shootings are not slowing down. So I will play my disclaimer first, because we all know I can't say two words without that, and then we will jump right into it. The information in this podcast is provided for general informational and entertainment purposes only and may not reflect the current law in your jurisdiction at the time you're listening. Nothing in this episode creates an attorney-client relationship, nor is it legal advice. Do not act or refrain from acting on the basis of any information included in or accessible through this episode without seeking appropriate legal or other professional advice on the particular facts and circumstances at issue from a lawyer or service provider licensed in your state, country, or other appropriate licensing jurisdiction. Hi, Deb. Hi. Thank you so much for joining me today. I would love for you to talk about your background and your qualifications. I know that you were a trauma specialist, boots on the ground in Newtown when the shooting happened 10 years ago. And you've done a lot of work on school shooting impacts and students in schools and what they can do and what we've learned from Sandy Hook and what we've learned from other shootings that we've had around the country and how we can possibly move forward and help our students and staff. But maybe you could give us a little background on how you got here.
Sure. So I live in Connecticut, and I don't think that there was anyone on that day who wasn't deeply impacted by the horror of it. And I just remember sitting in my office knowing that I needed to do something, that there was just something so wrong in our world. And however I could impact this was going to. So my background is I'm a licensed professional counselor. Trauma is my specialty, has been my entire career of 20 plus years. I'm a whole diplomate status as a mental health specialist in trauma counseling. And, also relevant is that Connecticut, particularly Fairfield County, was directly impacted by the 9/11 terrorist attack. And so this concept of what we think of as communal trauma is when something, an event occurs that affects an entire community. Sometimes, it's one small town. Sometimes it's an entire country. Sometimes it's the entire world. And I think in our case, certainly the Sandy Hook school shooting did affect the whole world.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that as it pertains to 9/11, but you're right. It was the same geographical area because so many people in this area worked in Manhattan.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That I hadn't thought of that as that level of communal crisis and trauma.
And we also have to think about what a person's life experiences before this event that's right in front of us, right? Because that baggage is brought into who we are on that day, meeting that next really horrific challenge. And so absolutely the shadow of 9/11 impacted how certain groups of people responded, reacted, recovered to the degree they did or didn't.
You were on the ground and in Newtown, and that is in and of itself, I don't think, an experience that is shared, right? That's the people who were there. You experienced something unique at the time. Mm-hmm. It's seeming less and less unique. It's seeming like we're having more and more school shootings, and we're having to put these teams together more and more frequently. And do you feel, in your experience, at least over the last 10 years, that we've gotten any better in preventing, or I shouldn't say preventing. I don't want to go down that road because I think that's a whole other, we could go down that road. I know I have a few ideas on how we could prevent these, but I guess, in how we're responding to them for schools specifically, like how are we giving students what they need? And I look at this and I think of, I live close by. I'm not in Newtown, but I live close by. And 2 years after the Newtown shootings, my son was diagnosed with PTSD as a result of them, based on his experience on that day and what they had gone through. It had never dawned on me ever living in this area that my son, who was safe on that day, would have this kind of response. It just didn't dawn on me.
Well, right there is that's uniquely painful reality of trauma. We know that your son was physically safe, but he was not emotionally or psychologically safe, were any of us. Schools
Right.
throughout the state of Connecticut, everyone was in lockdown. Schools were closing early, but parents were panicked, and appropriately so. It isn't a surprise to me, right, that someone not in your town was diagnosed with developed
Right.
PTSD. And unfortunately, it isn't a surprise to me that it took 2 years to figure that out.
Yeah.
That
And I had a child, just for separate. He was in therapy. This was not a child who was not in therapy. He was in therapy because he was. And so it wasn't like he wasn't seeing somebody. So, it's just, I think it's important to recognize. And now I think it's less shocking, right? Now I think 10 years ago, it never dawned on me. I'd like to believe that now we recognize that this can happen. What are we as schools doing, or what are we as schools? What do we need to do? I know there's a tremendous amount of focus on how do we support students. And I do want to talk about that for a minute, but I also don't want to forget that they're not the only they're not the only people in the school building who require support.
No, absolutely not. I think our educators, support staff, anyone who's in that physical building. And then I would also go to say, it's like they're that primary inner circle. But over time, the staff shifts. People leave. They go to another school. Like they can't stay in that same community. They choose not. So in Sandy Hook, they choose not to go to the new building built on the same footprint as the old school. It's positioned differently.
Right.
However, you're basically entering the same driveway that you always entered.
Exactly.
And so staff leave, new staff come in. They have this secondary trauma. Think about it as kind of a closed community of trauma. The students, the staff, they went through this all together. And then new people come in. They're impacted by how those students and that staff are recovering, healing from it, while expected, quite honestly, inappropriately expected, in my opinion, to go back and function, to be in front of classrooms, to continue as teachers when their lives have been irrevocably changed.
Yeah.
So I think we're a great deal of demands, regardless of where the school is. I've also worked with Parkland Community, Oxford, Michigan, Uvalde, wherever it is, whatever the age is, the expectations are the same.
Mm-hmm. I think that goes to, as a former teacher, and I worked in Boston Public, so I certainly worked with students who had experienced their own version of trauma. But as a former teacher, I don't know how they're expected to have the proper training to handle their own level of trauma as well as the students' level of trauma. How can we, so we're talking about the students and yes, how they're impacted, but then we're also talking about the family, the parents, the siblings, the staff, the teachers, everybody from whoever unlocks that door in the morning to the head of the school have these impacts. So how are you handling your own level of trauma? And is it even possible to provide that level of support?
Exactly. I think in the early days, when my team came on board, was over 2 years after the shooting. And once I was in the school, there were programs in place. There were programs for the students, and there was support for the staff. But I have to say, it was just inadequate. It's just enough. And
I have a question. Is this something we can prepare for? And the reason I ask that is I have students, as a special education attorney, I represent students who have mental health issues or other issues who cannot handle, say, a lockdown practice or drill, right? So we're doing these drills, and I guess the hope is to learn how to respond properly or safely in a situation like this. And the first thing I think of is I haven't heard any stories from any teachers where kids didn't respond properly, where kids didn't do what they asked them to do, where when they were in crisis, they couldn't control their classroom. I haven't heard any stories of that. So
yes, correct. Correct.
It's just an observation I've made. It's just an observation I've made. So is there a benefit to doing these lockdown drills that are, heightening students and staff's anxiety and stress over the situation? Because I understand that with like a fire drill, because we're teaching you where the path is to go, because otherwise you may not know if you're, whatever. But I'm just not hearing that we're having those kinds of mistakes happen during these shootings. So can we prepare for them?
I think there's a few things that I want to say to this. I think the answer is yes, and I think the answer is no. There is absolutely, I don't believe that there's any way to prepare anyone to actually be in that circumstance. I've had a lot of conversations with a trooper who responded to that school that day. And I said to him, you were trained to be there. You had the skills. You were trained. You knew how to respond to that situation. I said, no one else did. And I don't think we can. I think there are so many responsibilities being placed on educators today beyond what their actual responsibility is supposed to be, is to educate our students.
Right.
To have that responsibility to keep children safe is, I think, egregiously inappropriate. But that's where it lands.
Right. Well, look, teachers are going to feel that whether you tell them that or not, right? They feel it's their job, right? There's no teacher out there who doesn't think their classroom is their responsibility.
Sure. But I think the difference is that's who you are as a person, right? You as an educator, you take that on because this is my role. This is how I choose to perform my job. That's one thing. It's another thing to have that responsibility placed on you by the Board of Education.
Fair. Yes.
Right. So it's right. That's an expectation, right? Not only are you supposed to arrive at 7:45. Oh, don't forget.
Don't forget.
It's egg today from the potential school shooting, and then some of the states who want to arm teachers. I think the burden being placed on educators is going to get, if it isn't already at a tipping point, is going to get to a tipping point, because I don't think that teachers can carry all of that responsibility that's being placed on them, and they're burning out. So that's a little bit of an aside from what your question was. I think there are very mindful ways that preparation can happen. I don't think unexpected drills are the way to go. I don't think that's effective. I think back to the early days and how much distress every time there was a lockdown drill caused. And this is the nature of trauma. A trigger can occur. It takes just an instant to trigger someone. It can take hours, days, weeks, months to reset that person's nervous system to get back to where they were before the trigger. So that doesn't sound like particularly trauma-informed approach to preparation. Can there be trauma-informed approaches to preparation? Yes. Here's a novel idea. How about we trust our educators, who we trust to teach our students, with this responsibility to work with this within the classroom to help their students be prepared in the event they need to be.
Yeah. When we talk about that, trusting them to be prepared, because I didn't hear of any teachers who didn't respond properly either. So what could help, though, a teacher? I saw a clip on, Facebook or something, one of those little videos of somebody who was looking to purchase things off of teachers' lists. And one of the requests were those like a fabric that goes around the table so you can't see under the table, as a way to hide students. And I thought, wow, that's on your teacher wish list, is something for your classroom in order to hide your students. So how are we equipping teachers, or how can we? Because I see this and I see things, it's that time of year, everyone's buying gifts and I'm seeing ads for things to help lock your classroom door. What are we doing to give teachers support and staff? And I mean, not support and staff, but support that they need to be prepared in those moments. Is that effective?
Not enough.
Right.
I mean, if you think about the question that you just asked, that teachers have to have wish lists to be able to operate their classrooms is a problem, first and foremost, let alone what they might put on and around safety issues.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is a systemic issue in our country where educators are not supported and are not given the resources they needed. And it does all start there. Our students spend the majority of their lives are spent in school. And so I think there needs to be some significant shifts.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I remember when I was a special education teacher in the public school, and in some circumstances it was hard to. Some teachers didn't have the time to implement something I needed them to implement. I can't even imagine if I was asking them to also add on to that all the mental health needs of all the students in their classroom. So, from a special education component, from my perspective, which is where I usually come from, we're seeing right now an incredible rise in mental health issues for students in classrooms across the board, and for a variety of reasons. And I'm also looking at, when we talk about these school shootings, they're not just impacting the students in the community where they happen. This is now impacting students, not just in neighboring towns either, but across the country. And I suspect part of that is our access to information, the internet. Kids are hearing this at the time. During Sandy Hook, where my son was, they didn't think any of the students knew what was going on. They didn't realize some of the older students had iPads. So 10 years ago, they weren't even thinking of that. But now, nothing like this would happen without a student like getting an alert on their watch or something in the middle of classroom that, oh, there's a school shooting somewhere in this country. So,
agreed.
So I think that we're also, this is impacting the broader community. And how can we help those students understand that? I think, to your point, if we're asking the local school district to move on, to move forward, to get over it, how can we help students who are elsewhere? I mean, we need to acknowledge that they are impacted by this too, right?
Well, something I said to you earlier, which I think is such an important statement, is the number one killer of our children and adolescents is gun violence. That is a public health emergency, which isn't being treated as one.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is a major isn't even a strong enough word. If there was an illness, I mean, we're still in a pandemic. We took pretty significant dramatic actions to control the pandemic. So it isn't that it is impossible to truly make change with gun violence, but that systemic change has not happened yet. Change is happening. Definitely is happening. And unfortunately, it comes coming from survivors who lost their children to gun violence. It's the people who, 10 years ago, if you had asked me about gun violence, I probably would have said something. Yes, it's awful. It's awful. Having lived and breathed it for the last 10 years in a very kind of personal way, this is a passion. This is a fixable problem. It just takes the right people and the right elected offices to have the courage to do so. And until that changes, until that narrative truly changes in a more global way, and I also want to say this is a problem in the United States. This is not an international problem.
Right.
This is a United States of America unique problem.
Right.
That
We're
we
extra
should be
special
able to fix. We are extra special in a really, really messed up way.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is the biggest point. This is just us, and there's no denying it's just us. And I think to that point, and while I'm focusing on mental health, I mean, if I woke up tomorrow and there were no guns in the country, I'd have no problem with that. And we know that that has successfully worked for other countries. So I'm unclear as to why we don't do that. That being said, because if I see something that works, I'm not opposed to trying it. That's just how I function. But
That seems quite reasonable.
yeah, so that's just me. I'm all about the data, but I hear what you're saying, because we're talking right now about how are we handling the mental health response to it, as opposed to how do we stop it from happening in the first place. And that,
we are in a very reactionary space still 10 years later. And I can tell you from the mental health perspective, there's a few things that I think that your listeners need to understand. One is, we were, children and adolescents were already probably in a very kind of emergent, urgent state before the pandemic. The pandemic has amplified this 10,000 fold.
Yeah.
There aren't enough therapists trained to work with children and adolescents. That's an enormous problem because of the huge demand. I went into lockdown too. I was living this. This was another one of those shared experiences, living through that fear, being isolated, all the same things that everyone else was going through. And the need hasn't stopped.
Right.
The burden on us to continue to provide services has only increased, and that's a significant issue. So there's an access issue right now. And I want to go back to what you were saying about your son and your son's diagnosis. He was in therapy. I would make a guess he wasn't in trauma therapy.
No.
And there is a difference. There's an enormous difference between a general therapist and a trauma specialist.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's interesting you say that, actually, because the person who diagnosed him was a newer therapist we got, because we had 2 children who we were adopting through foster care who had a trauma background. So we brought in a new therapist to work with our children adjusting to our new children. It really had nothing to do with that, but he did have trauma experience and a trauma background. And he was the one who was like, do you guys have any idea what's happening here? And it explained so many things that we had no clue about, that suddenly it was like, boom, it all clicked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm still treating people coming to my office 10 years later who are now either just able to recognize that the trauma is an impact, or have had multiple failed attempts at therapy before this. Mm-hmm. That's very, very common. Multiple failed attempts at therapy that may have been framed as trauma therapy, but really were not. Initially following an event, that first month, kind of say, any reaction that's happening, we consider pretty normal to an abnormal situation. And we won't even give a diagnosis of trauma at that point. But after that first month, if things aren't getting back on track, if sleep isn't improving, if kids aren't getting on the bus and able to get to school and stay in school all day long, then we know we need to do something different. And that has to be trauma therapy that works with that extreme dysregulation of the central nervous system. Mm-hmm. And there isn't enough talk therapy that will change central nervous system dysregulation. That's just a simple fact. It's like you said, data. This is science. This is brain function. This whole idea of how do we continue to support people down the road? It's got to be good trauma therapy. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You also have to understand, once someone experiences an event like this, even if they get the best possible therapy, when another event occurs, another shooting, doesn't even have to be a school shooting, just an act of violence, that can be triggering, and quite often is triggering. And then the whole community is stirred up again, back in time, 2012. And, when I first learned about the Uvalde shooting, my heart dropped and I thought, oh, here we go again. This is going to hit hard because it's another elementary school. And what have we learned as a society? What have we learned? What are we doing differently? What are we doing better to prevent this? And I think, well, there are a lot of good people, really adamant, passionate, caring people trying to do what they can do within their sphere. Until things happen at the federal level, I don't unfortunately feel like this is going to change. And that is why, we talked about language and phrasing. I do not, the fallout of the Sandy Hook school shooting was tragic, but the event was not a tragedy, because a tragedy implies that it couldn't be prevented.
Yes.
This could have been prevented.
Yes, I'd ask you that because I've heard people refer to Sandy Hook shooting, Sandy Hook massacre, Sandy Hook tragedy, Sandy Hook, what is the proper term? And I appreciate that perspective, which is a tragedy is not preventable. So is it a tragedy if this is happening over and over again and we know it's going to continue happening? How is that a tragedy? That sounds like ignorance to me, but it's just how I would define it. I have a question about us addressing trauma because as I said, I have children who have trauma backgrounds. And so one thing that I heard a lot was we're a trauma-focused school, we're a trauma-informed school, we do trauma training, all these different wonderful buzzwords that turn around. That are thrown around. And so I requested all the training materials because I was dying to see what training was done to, make these teams so trauma-informed. And what I found was absolutely not a single document that even had the word trauma on it, but there was a lot of social emotional learning. And I was hearing that term a lot, which I think is important. And actually, I think my previous couple episodes ago, I did one on social emotional learning, and it is very critical, but it's not trauma informed, right? It might be a piece of it, but what are we doing? Are we even... I keep hearing these words that we're trauma informed or we're providing trauma training, but are we? Is that what is trauma informed?
I think it changes district to district.
Right. So there is no unified what is trauma informed or trauma trained. There's no checklist that says this is what a trauma informed school is. At least I couldn't find that checklist anywhere.
I think if it existed, I'm not sure I would agree with what the content is, because I think there are individuals who align with different models and do things in different ways. That doesn't necessarily mean that those models are the most effective. I absolutely practice from an evidence-based model. My intention is to be the final therapist anyone ever has to work with related to that specific trauma that they walk into the door with me. And I'm successful. I am evidence-based, and I also understand that there are very specific kinds of therapy that can reset the brain after trauma. And they must be used, or respectively, you are wasting your time and that of this person who is suffering for you. And I think we have a higher responsibility to get beyond whatever our own beliefs are to do the best possible care that we can. In Sandy Hook, there was a lot of training of the staff, helping them to manage classroom management, which was sorely needed and really important and very helpful. Is that pervasive throughout the country? No, probably not. And, so that's the thing that we're dealing with, is that different districts doing different things. There isn't a standardization. And I think it's also to have clarity about mental health in our school systems. Certain districts do have actual clinics where the children can be in therapy.
Yeah.
And that's a very different perspective versus having social workers, school counselors expected to provide trauma treatment to students in their schools which is really outside the scope of what they've been trained to do or be, or what their role is intended to be. And I think this is what's happening is we can't ignore the amount of trauma that there is in our schools. We cannot, but it's also how effective can we be in addressing that and still do all of the other things that need to be done.
Right. Right. How can we? Well, and I think, it's what's baffling to me is when I hear districts saying, they have a possibility or an opportunity or a grant to bring in a clinic and they say no, for whatever reason. And I'm baffled by it. I know one of our elementary schools in Connecticut have voted to have armed guards starting January 1st. I have no idea how that's going to play out. And I know for the students I have in that district who have special education needs, who have mental health issues, I'm going to be able to have safety plans for them and, hopefully be able to help those students. But, that's going to be just the students identified with special education needs who have identified mental health needs who might be able to get the support they need to handle the fact that they have armed guards in their parking lot. That's not typical. And if students are aware of school shootings and now they have armed guards, I just don't even know what that's going to do to their anxiety levels. But that's just me.
I would also say how it's rolled out is going to be very important. And part of it is I think that, that was the norm in Sandy Hook. So, and it's actually fine. The SROs were actually a big part of the community. It can be done and it can be done well. I think the issue really is that there is a need for them.
Right.
Is the issue. Right. I think we cannot, get caught up into, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make this work? We have to get back to that root cause, and that's gun violence. Yeah. And that is both the legal possession of guns in the home, that is the illegal possession of guns in the home. There's a lot of
types of weapons, the access to certain types of weapons that aren't meant to do anything but kill other human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So I absolutely concur. Thank you so much for speaking with me on this. I wish we had clear-cut, concrete answers for people who either say, I want to bring more awareness to my school, I want to be able to bring some kind of trauma-informed system to our school. Are there resources you recommend, or are you a resource that could speak to people who want to try and bring programs like this into their school that address mental health issues for their students systemically, not just as a reaction?
So I think that you mentioned Abby Clemens.
Yeah.
Amy and a couple of other educators, one from Stoneman Douglas in Parkland and one from New York, have developed Teachers United to End Gun Violence. This is an organization that I'm proud to be associated with, but we are working to end gun violence, and this is for educators. This is educator to educator and any other staff. Right. Okay. So I'm considered support staff. Right. So that is definitely.
I think anybody in that building is an educator of some sort, right? If you exist in that building, you're contributing to the education of those children.
So I think that is a wonderful resource for anyone, and they welcome anyone to join with their mission. They're doing a lot of good work, a lot of education, a lot of support. In, I think, a very meaningful way, and it's grassroots, right? Abby's experience in Sandy Hook.
And Abby, I don't know if we were talking about this before we started on the record, but Abby is a teacher who survived Sandy Hook and has done a tremendous amount of advocacy related to gun violence. And as you said, Teachers Unified to End Gun Violence is this wonderful organization that many of you are involved in, who had direct access with Parkland or Sandy Hook and in gathering educators. And I will have all that contact information in my show notes for this. Right. I'm very familiar with it, and I'm really excited. And I'm actually hoping Abby we've been talking, she may come on and talk more about that in specifics, just on that specific organization. But thank you so much. And I will also have in my show notes your contact and your website information And I know that you speak with schools and that you do a lot of this work as well, correct? You go to, you've worked with Parkland and other areas to help. Unfortunately, you're an expert.
Yeah, I'm going back down to Parkland in February in anticipation of their 5th anniversary. So, yeah, there is, I want to end this with some messages of hope, because they are there. I think for the survivors of Sandy Hook, for the entire community, many of whom I know personally, that there is hope, that there can be freedom, release, repair. This is not something that leaves a person. I believe that, but it also does not have to continue to have its claws in an individual either in such a painful, harmful way. And there are good treatments that can provide that. So there is hope. And I'm happy to talk to anybody who needs that information and how to access it.
So if you're listening, and Deb Del Vecchio-Scully is the only person speaking your truth, and they need to get in touch with you, what is the best way to do that? Is that through your websites, your email, which I will have all of that in my show notes?
Yeah. Through my group practice, centerforneuropotential.com. And they can certainly email contact@centerforneuropotential.com, and I will personally respond.
Outstanding. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and your story and your experience. It's really heartbreaking to me that it's something we're still talking about, but as long as we need to, I'm so happy that we have people like you, like Abby Clemens, like Teachers Unify to end gun violence, so that who are not going to let this message go away and not let it get quiet or muffled or stomped. So thank you for all the work that you are doing on behalf of gun violence and our students in our schools.
Thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Please don't forget to follow this podcast so you don't miss any new episodes, and leave a review when you have a chance. If there's anything you want to hear about or comment on, please go to my Facebook page, Special Ed on Special Ed, and find me there. I'll see you next time here on Special Ed on Special Ed. Have a fabulous day. The views expressed in this episode are those of the speakers at the time of the recording and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company, or even that individual today.